You're listening to the Devil Dog Talk Show.
This show contains explicit material and is recommended for ages 18 and older for mature audiences only. But hey, it's the internet.
You're rolling.
All right.
Go ahead and start us out.
That's remarkable. Remarkable. All right, so today we're here with Dusk Bennet at the dBu Ranch, and we're starting off our dBu Ranch Daze series. And I met Dusk, of course, through social media. It's kind of been my go-to thing lately. Yeah, right? And so it was one of those things that absolutely by chance and blew me away. We hung out the other week, and it was about 7 hours.
It was a bit of time. Like, I thought it was going to be, come over here to the studio, you're gone in an hour or two.
Yeah, but then we started talking. Yeah, we started talking, and even just right now, before we started, we hit the record button. We were just diving into some interesting format of conversation, not just engineering, but the audio equipment. Of course, I was showing off my King Bees, which are considerably hefty. Like I was telling you, it's like that movie No, it's not Lock, Stock. It's Snatch. And
I haven't seen it.
Boris the butcher has a scene that he's getting a gun and he's selling it. He's selling it to the guy, and he goes, and if it doesn't work, you could always hit them to death with it. And I love that whole concept because this microphone is that. It's very well structured. It's heavy, and surprisingly enough, it's made by Neat, and I think it's a Gibson subsidiary. But and then we got started talking about these microphones that we're currently recording on, which is an industry standard. And if you're a geek like me, this is a topic of conversation that gets you into another conversation and another conversation and another conversation. And so first I'd like to say welcome to the Devil Dog Talk Show.
Thanks for the invite.
Thank you for having me at dBu Ranch, because we're going to get into both things. And the next thing I would like to have you do is, if you could, just go ahead and introduce yourself a bit, and then that way we can launch forward and, of course, go down the rabbit holes.
Sure. So to your listeners out there, some of you may already be familiar with me, most of you not. I'm a recent replant, how do you say that? Transplant, I guess. Into this San Diego scene. I actually went to San Diego here in the 90s. I went to JC. I was a Palomar student for a while. Miracosta grad, yay.
Go Miracosta.
Go Miracosta. So I love Miracosta. It was a very important school in my development as an engineer and as a student. And then from there, I went to Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, where I spent 3 years pursuing my BA in communications, which was an emphasis in the recording arts. So I knew early on engineering is what I wanted to do. And San Diego is where I started that path. I think it's very appropriate that it's come full circle and I've returned to the San Diego scene. As far as who I am and where I came from, there's a big gap between 1995 when I left and 2020 when I came back.
Wow. That is some time. That's some time, yeah.
And if somebody had asked a question that knew me back then, well, where did you go? The answer is I spent 25, 26 years in LA working towards a goal. And my goal was to become the best, most competent recording engineer that I could be. And truthfully, I remember telling my professors at Miracosta when I was first starting out, I wanted to be the best recording engineer ever. After spending a few years in LA, I realized that's just not possible. There are so many guys who are dead that I will never have the opportunity to just outpace. It's not possible. But I can be the best that I can be. And in certainly looking back at my discography over the last 20 years, I can say the best I can be is way better than what I'm hearing from a lot of the people that I'm competing against on a market-based level. It's not that we're out to make music in terms of making records that's like, well, mine's better than yours. It's all music, and it's meant to be a subjective thing. But being a former professor, which is what I did do when I was in LA for 12 years at Loyola Marymount, going back to that school, part of my job was to teach students there is an objective truth to making records. This one is better, and let me show you why. Let me analyze it analytically as an academic. That's my part of my job, is to lay it out and say, no, this record actually is superior, and here's why. This record is inferior, and here's why. And yes, in many cases, it's not just the equipment, it's the operators. And without getting too far aside, because I'm sure you'll want to revisit this idea later, I came to the realization over the last 20 years that, yeah, some operators really do suck, and they have no business engineering themselves. I think that's fine as long as everyone knows that. I am not a commercial painter, but I painted my entire studio myself. I imagine a commercial painter would come in here and say, it's not bad.
Of course.
Yeah. I do. It's like, well, it's the best that I could do with what I had, because I don't have a big budget, and I can see that. But when you start stepping into the big time and you're trying to do bigger projects, there's an argument to be made for having people who are extremely gifted at what they do the work for you. And that's what I have focused my energy on over the last 25 years while I was out of San Diego, honing my skills so that I could bring my equipment and my skill set back and put San Diego's music scene on a competitive level with the national music scene. And that's not meant to be a slight against existing engineers in the community here, and many of them I've met, who do have skills and are quite gifted in their own way. But I think to reach a national level, you need to bring in somebody with national experience. And I do happen to have that because I've worked on so many projects over the last 20 years that have seen some sort of national or worldwide acclaim. You kind of learn some stuff along the way working with the people who were the founders of the business.
That's very interesting that you bring that up, because like we were discussing kind of off air, but in the approach of what we were discussing with podcasting, of course, right? A lot of people have interests in podcasting currently, and a lot of people are actually breaking into podcasts. Like I was just talking to my boy's horse trainer. She does polo horse training up in Escondido, just right next to Safari Park. It's called White Horse Polo Ranch or something like that. Great lady, Miss Susan. And we were discussing podcasts. She was very interested, and I was telling her about the podcast, and I was telling her, hey, if you're interested, man, we got something cool. And the reason why is because I noticed that she plays instruments inside her house. I use the restroom. And of course I was like, hey, these are really nice monitors. That is a really nice equalizer, and that's a gorgeous bass. Do you play? And of course she had the piano, or I should say keyboards set up. And her and her roommates or housemates do play music. And of course I just started, gnawing away at the ear. I'm like, man, that's really amazing. Like, have you ever been interested in podcasting or, being on a podcast yourself? She goes, no, but that's something that I find a lot of people are breaking into the concept of podcasting. And there's a lot of well-produced podcasts. There's a lot of well-produced or well-intended artists, guests, hosts, everything in between. And the one thing that I always try to set myself apart on is the production style and the artistic value of what it is I'm producing. So when you bring up, there's tons of competition. Like I was just telling my wife, I am a very tiny little drop of water in a very large expanding bucket.
We kind of all are.
Right? And that's very true. We all are in our own existence. And of course, dealing with flops and successes, I always try to focus on what I can do. So it resonated well when we started talking about not just equipment, but your expertise in audio engineering. And it really made me so humbled that you would take the time to even kind of, sit down and talk with me one-on-one, and even do this episode and the next episodes that we have coming up with guests that you've brought into this amazing studio. You guys can't see it. I'm going to put up pictures, of course, when we put out everything for this episode, maybe some videos. But, you guys got to go check out dBu Ranch. It's called Back to Two Tracks on YouTube. And I'll let Dusk, break down a little bit more what he's got going on with his YouTube channel and social media. But to discuss the value of artful production, there's gaps in what's going on in the world. I know some guys and girls that will use their iPhone as their primary recording device. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But when you want to get into a world of audio engineering, and production that takes you from one level to the next. Like we were just talking about microphones for 5-10 minutes. Like we can go on like
I'll go on all day on mics.
Yeah, it could be just dynamic, condenser, ribbon, tube, what type of amplification. I just found out what T-power is.
Yeah.
I never even
most of your
heard of
listeners
it.
won't. In fact, most quote unquote engineers today don't even know what T-power is, because you'd have to be an old school guy to know what it is.
See, and that's something that I always find remarkable, especially when you're looking for guests, right? And this is something that I go back and forth with on people. You can produce 100 episodes a year. Okay, I know guys that produce an episode every week or 2 episodes a week. And I go, dude, I could never keep up with that. Managing, my lifestyle, my circumstances, disabilities, all that in between. I could not manage that type of production style without a huge team. And a lot of these people do have huge teams. And then when we met, we were discussing how you came up with this studio. I fell in love with the concept of vision and accomplishment. And that's something I really want to discuss with you now, is when you were transitioning from, of course, a young man, starting your journey in something that I believe you told me you wanted to do this.
I knew at 13 years old, this is what I wanted to do.
So this was something that you were passionate about, even, initiating your journey down to the river of audio engineering, right? And here you are, 25, 28, 30 plus years later, back in the county that you grew up in and did all this planning when you were young. What was it like to get from point A to point B, and how did you stick to that vision? And how did we get to here at dBu Ranch, where, if you could see it, guys, I'm telling you, the first time I walked in, I was blown away, flabbergasted, all the shock and awe you can imagine about what a studio brings in the concept of recording at a studio. And I've recorded at a lot of studios, have a lot of friends in the industry, and to see somebody bringing back analog equipment in the way that you have, how did you manifest that?
That's a good question. In fact, rewinding the tape a long, long way back, I remember being a student down here in the 90s, and a girl that I used to hang out with off and on. I remember one night we were talking on the phone, and this is when I was a Maricosta student. I had said to her, man, I wish I could just fast forward straight into the future, because I wanted to just bypass this whole idea of needing to wait to get to where I wanted to be. So I do that today, and I can say, okay, I've arrived. Like what I foresaw or wanted to see back when I was 20 years old, here I am pushing 50, and it's like, okay, 30 years later, dang, got it. The thing that is unfortunate is during that period of time, I've lost 30 years of my life. And I can't get it back. So, and I guess everybody at one point starts to have that sort of, that realization, we call it midlife crisis or whatever, but the realization is like, man, to get here, man, I exhausted a lot of time. And, to answer the question, well, what was the path that led here? It was a very long and very tenuous path, in the sense that I didn't take the path that I thought I was going to take. When I went to LA and started working in studios as an engineer, as I was a student, I might add. I mean, the minute I walked into LA, I started walking around, knocking on doors of studios. And the first studio I went to that actually gave me a job was 4th Street Recording in Santa Monica. I still know the owners because they were sort of mentors, I guess. And that was where I had the opportunity to work with Incubus, Fiona Apple, Sprung Monkey. There was all these bands that my boss, Jim Wirt, was producing, and he just needed a guy to show up for a few hours in the afternoon just to kind of hold the fort down.
Got it.
And I told Jim, look, I'm a student at Loyola Marymount. I can schedule classes so that my afternoons, for the most part, are open. And he's like, great, just come down whenever you want. They gave me a key to the studio after a week. They didn't even know me. I mean, it was really weird, almost surreal.
I mean, you just brought up something so profound, because it literally timestamps the era. Mm-hmm. And for our listeners, like, we have all you people out there that are listening. I love you guys so much, but like, to timestamp an era where you're literally getting into an industry that was at this date and time just huge, massive.
Oh yeah,
like, you couldn't do that. Like, and nowadays, it's impossible. Like we were just talking about opening doors, right?
Yeah.
And you got a key within a week?
Yeah.
You know,
They were like, Jim, it actually wasn't Jim, it was his ex-wife, Kathleen, who was like, look, Jim is so busy. Apparently they had a former intern that worked at or was a LMU student. And then what happened at LMU, which is, I think, what really set them up, because LMU had a recording program, and this was the first major commercial studio, it was probably, as the crow flies, probably 5 or 6 miles north of the school. Of course, it was on one of the busiest boulevards in West LA, so it wasn't always, a 10-minute trip. But I think their attitude was, look, every 3 years we would lose our student. And then we'd be stuck. And I just happened to be the guy that walked in, was like, hey, I'm here. And they're like, great, we just lost our last guy. He was good. If you're interested, we'll put you to work. And the one thing that I had developed prior to LMU was a good work ethic, particularly around studios. I understood the idea that you don't sit around. Obviously, cell phones and computers were not something that were readily available to us back in the mid-90s. You weren't walking around with a cell phone or a laptop, so I didn't have a whole lot of distractions. So when I was at the studio, my distraction was cleaning stuff. Like if I'm not needed in the control room, I would clean the office. If I was done with the office, I would clean the little kitchenette area, make sure that everything's clean and organized. And if they would go to lunch and leave the control room for 40 minutes, I would clean the control room. And you just kind of learn. And of course, day after day, they would come back and start seeing like, wow, this guy's kind of on it. Like he's really, like before we think it, he's already done it. And it opened up more doors for me, because within a month of being a key holder to the studio, Kathleen came to me one night. It's like, there's a new artist that wants to do some recording here. Jim has decided he wants to pass on the opportunity. He wants to give it to you. Here's a catch. They can only record at night. So you're going to have to work this around your sleep schedule, because this isn't our problem. I'm like, that's fine. I'll make it work. They said, you're going to collect cash, $35 an hour. 20 is for you. And then you're going to bring the 15 an hour to us. She's going to pay you cash. Okay, whatever you say, Kathleen, it'll be done. And, that was one of my first sessions. Still something that musically, even though I can listen back to it, 30 plus years later and go like, well, it was kind of, clearly baby pictures of me as a producer. Musically, the stuff sounds pretty dang good. And it's because I'd already worked the room enough over that 1 month period. My previous experience being a student here in Maricosta, I knew how to record. Like I knew what I was doing. I just didn't know that gear, and I didn't know that room. But sort of shadowing and sitting by, Jim for a month and a half, they came to me and said, "You're ready to do this, Dusk. We know what you can do. You're ready for this." And I was terrified. I'm like, oh my God, I can't do this. This is going to be a train wreck. Actually, it wasn't. That night went really well, and the client called me back and said, we want to do more stuff, and it turned into sort of a short-term, long-term thing where I was working with these guys for the better part of several months. They kept booking the room out, and it got to one point where Kathleen had said to me, you know what, Dusk, the whole bookkeeping thing is too much of a pain in the butt. Why don't you just keep the money? Just don't even pay us. I'm like, really? So I'm making $35 an hour to engineer a record? And this is back when, minimum wage was $7 an hour. So I was thinking to myself, I feel like I should give you guys something for giving me this opportunity. And they're like, just don't screw up. And I'm like, I won't. And I stuck with those guys for 2 years.
Oh, wow.
And then at one point, and I think in retrospect, this may have been a mistake. But you never know. And it's not that I wasn't warned. Jim had just finished doing a record for Interscope, a band called Shuffle Puck, which was a really cool band. I came to realize that the reason they got signed is because I believe Interscope, as I'm just guessing, they sounded so similar to Weezer. In my opinion, they actually sounded better than Weezer. I think they sounded so similar to Weezer that they were pulled off the market. That's what labels did back then. Oh. If they felt there's a band that's going to compete with another
Somebody
band,
they already signed
they
or
would
something?
sign it and throw it away. and they would sell the publishing. Well, that's exactly what they did.
I have heard of that happening.
They used to do it a lot.
Yeah, where they'll buy out the competition and then just push it off or hold on to it.
They shelve the record.
Yeah,
it's called shelving it.
Yeah.
It was a thing. I don't know if that practice still happens because, frankly, labels don't have that kind of money to throw around. I mean, they have a hard enough time selling a record that's good, much less one that won't sell. So this one, I believe, could have sold. And Jim had tracked that record with David Bianco over at the record plant. And he had the opportunity to go back to the record plant to do a demo session. And he invited me over because he knew I was all about the guy that wanted to run the big toys. He knew Dusk is hell-bent on getting behind an SSL and learning how to use the big room with the big toys. So he did a really nice thing and said, I'm going to invite you to come along with me, or you can... I had a session scheduled in the room that day. He's like, either you can do the session here and get paid for it, or you can just postpone the session, do it next weekend, and come with me to Record Plant today. And I jumped on the Record Plant thing like you wouldn't believe it. I'm like, I will be there. I postponed my session. I hung out the whole day, and I started getting friendly with the assistants in the room just to kind of learn, okay, how's it work here? The rooms were really impressive. Particularly back in the 90s. I was blown away by it. And by the end of the day, I was in with the crew there. Like, it was a very, very easygoing sort of relationship. And I bumped into a couple of guys, and I went back to 4th Street, my tiny little MCI and my Studer tape machine, continued making records for another several months. And at one point, I reached out to a friend at the record plant and had said, look, I'd like to have the opportunity to work there. Like, Jim's studio is great, but I feel that I want to learn how to operate on big sessions, and I want to be noticed on big records. And I don't think it's going to happen at 4th Street Recording. And I had heard that from multiple producers that had come through the room. They're like, look, you're way better than this place. You need to move on. Jim actually approached me at one point and said, look, Dusk, personally, if I were you, I would stay here because you got the keys to the place. We trust you. You're about to graduate. Your career could really launch out of this studio. If you go to Record Plant, it's McDonald's, bro. You're going to be going, do you want fries with that?
Oh, my God.
And he called it because I went to Record Plant. I didn't walk away from that job. In fact, the last thing that Kathleen told me is you will always have a job here. And I actually heard the same thing from Rose Mann when I left Record Plant a year and a half later. It was like, your work ethic, you will always have a job here. You come work, you come back, whatever. But I realized at one point, well, is that for me? Like, do I want to spend the rest of my life working at a small studio? Do I want to spend the rest of my life being a fry runner at a big studio? And the answer to both questions was no, I want to do it my own way. And I think by the time I graduated, I realized really quickly, I don't want to be, do you want fries with that? And I don't have the patience to sit through the pecking order, which could take upwards of 6 or 7 years in a big studio. Or if you stay in a small studio, you're just churning out records that'll probably never go anywhere unless there's money behind it. And then you're not moving. So it's like, well, how do you move up? And the answer is you have to make a hit record. That's it, plain and simple. It's a lot of it's luck, it's timing, it's having good skills, it's good interpersonal skills. And I didn't have any of that stuff at that point. Like, I knew how to make good records, but the rest of this stuff was just kind of like, I still hadn't grown up yet. Mm-hmm. And by the time I had kind of thrown in the towel at Record Plant, I just realized that this isn't going to work for me either. I actually went into, of all things, a job in post-production audio. Well, I was still a student at LMU. I was moved from Record Plant into a studio that was called Hollywood Recording Services. They did a lot of...
So before you go on to post-production, because not a lot of our listeners are audio guys or girls, right? So, and this is something that my good cousin, Johnny, and before we move forward too, I'd like to plug Podomatic.com because without that, I would not be doing podcasting at all.
Oh, wow.
And so Johnny always tells me, hey, dude, talk more about podcasting. Let me put Johnny on the spot. But yeah, so the concept of post-production, what is post-production recording?
Well, it can mean a lot, especially in Hollywood, because there's so many different facets to the film and broadcast industry. The particular subset of post that I was involved in was post audio for commercials. And when I'm saying commercials, we're talking radio commercials. Like all the spots that you wish you could turn off on the radio. That's what I...
So like the big voice that would be like, have you gone down to Market Fries today?
Yes.
Get your Market Fries today.
Yes.
I don't even know what Market Fries are. But
doesn't matter.
Yeah,
you just did it. You did what I did. In fact, this mic that we're using is a mic that we traditionally set up. It's like just sitting perpetually on the stand in there, and you'd bring in, a voiceover guy, and he would do his thing like, today, we're going to have a sale
Saturday
over
flea market.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That thing. We were making these... what we call 15, 30, and 60 spots, which were 15-second, 30-second, and 60 spots. And there would be a script, and the guy would come in and he would read from the script. I would record it to a DAT. And then this is pre-existing Pro Tools. Like Pro Tools didn't even exist in the studios at this studio yet. It was all like just barely about... By the time I left, we had Pro Tools in 2 rooms out of this facility that had like 10.
Oh my God. So like Pro Tools 1.
It was, It was like back when there was Pro Edit and Pro Deck. Like you had to close the program to get into the other. Oh, you want to record? Oh, that's a different program. You want to edit? Oh, you got to close and to get into this one. So it was a totally different world back then. And it was funny for me as a, guy looking back, but that's all we knew then. And that's one of the reasons Pro Tools wasn't really practical enough yet. So we did everything either on AudioFile or Fairlight, or you just recorded straight to a DAT and you just flew it into the airwaves. So you had to make sure that you recorded it right because there was no nonlinear editing. Anyway, It was there that I started doing some stuff, and I learned some technical stuff, which is where I learned how to wire everything and interface all the stuff together and learn how to solder and how to crimp cables and all that nonsense. I learned that there, and by the time I graduated out of that place where I was working on recording spots for radio commercials, and occasionally I did a couple of film trailers. Like the big movie voice that you might recall, Don LaFontaine, who was the guy that sort of initially created the vibe of it was a dark, rainy night. That guy.
And he had that booming voice.
Big subwoofer voice. I worked with him. Great guy. He would roll in shorts and a Hawaiian shirt. Stretch limo, took him around town everywhere.
Love it.
The only guy I worked with who walked into the room, I gave him the copy. He sat at the desk, literally like we're doing here. He sat at the desk, he read it, and he's like, okay, I'm ready. He went in. I had to do what was back then, we called them phone patches. So I had a little phone interface on the console where I would dial a number to some random advertising company like in Dallas or New York or New Jersey or wherever. And then I would patch them into the console so that they could hear his mic and give him instructions on how they want the read to happen. This thing happened all the time.
Wow.
This was the first guy where I set up the whole chain, and this guy was fast. Like I was slow compared to him because I was still a rookie. As far as engineering was concerned. He got on the mic, he put the thing on, he has his little glasses, and he's got that old man thing happening, and he gets in his voice, and then I just ask him for a quick level. I'm like, okay, we're good. I get the woman on the phone who is a spot producer, and she's like, okay, Don. I could tell she was intimidated too. I basically need you, just your typical read. He read it once. And the woman was like, yeah, that's it. We're done.
Nice.
And this guy made so much bloody money driving around town. That session was over in 10 minutes. It was the fastest session I'd ever done in my life. And I had been, up to that point, I had done a lot of these things. It was one of those situations where I was used to the director on the phone saying, could you hit that word a little bit harder for me? Because they always had to give their 2 cents. It's like, oh, well, could you do it like this? Could you do it like... It's like, dude, it's a freaking radio spot. People are going to turn it off.
They got to earn their money.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
They got to make it seem like they're doing something at least, right?
Exactly.
Like, I've seen that too, and even on the one takes, like, just give us a couple more. I don't know if there's really a reason on some of it before. And here's the thing too, is like if you got the money and time, then it is a luxury.
Yeah.
And I mean it, like even to this day, like the way production is now, everybody's recording into the box, right? And it's a luxury. Like getting a good performer, bands or vocalists or even like your what do they call them? The spot people, like you were just talking about. You know, professionals that go in and read voiceover.
The voiceover, yeah.
I can't even think of the damn thing. There's a lot of gaps that people don't know anymore because of the luxury of the way we edit and can edit and the technologies, the DAWs.
Well, it's eliminated a lot of job positions.
It has, and that's one of the values that I really want to shine light on, is because there's a huge difference between somebody that can, you know, get it done in the box, and it's something that is great. I love that it's there. It keeps people interested. It allows people like me to operate on in a marginal budget that's just, it's non-existent. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, when none of us have budgets.
Yeah, but here's the best part: is it allows you to grow into something different, and that's something that I hear a lot of nowadays is the loss of the craftsmanship that goes behind it. Like you were saying, that one take guy, it's like impossible to find anymore.
He was really freaking good.
Yeah, and then,
I gotta tell you.
Yeah, and then you bring in artists, like actual like bass players. There's this lady, I can never remember her name, and I love hearing bass. And she was on the documentary about the studio musicians. I cannot remember the documentary.
Oh, you're thinking of I just watched it yesterday.
It's not like one-hit wonders. It's something about big hitters. Or
so you're thinking of, I know exactly who you're talking about. She was the woman who was part of the Wrecking Crew that played bass on everything.
Thank you.
Yeah,
yes.
I know her name. I can see her picture right now. I just watched the video of Wrecking Crew the other day. I know it like it's the back of my hand. I'm surprised now that I'm on the spot I can't remember.
Right. Always on the spot, and you're like, ugh. That's how I feel like all the time. But the most amazing thing about those musicians is you give them a piece of music, they look at it, and then they play it perfectly. Or you give them some license to, you know, grow and develop and play. And that was another gentleman. He played the bass, I think it was on a James Brown track, and he hit a couple of notes. And there used to be, this is what it used to be. Like, I love the history of recording. You hit one wrong note, that's $50. You're paying, you're losing or you're paying. And I was like, dude, that's a lot of money back in the day. P.S., I bet that's a great motivating factor to keep people to play tight. Like, I grew up, I played in marching band, I played in jazz band, second chair trombone, and the tighter you played, the more you got to move up in band. And so being able to read music, being able to turn around a product is very difficult nowadays. Some people I know that are recording musicians, they don't know how to read music. They can play very, very well, but if you put a piece of music in front of them and go, all right, here you go, this is what you're getting paid to play,
yeah,
got nothing.
It's a problem. I would go so far as to say it's actually turned into an epidemic. And it's one of my frustrations as an engineer. And by the way, it was sort of the thought process behind creating the Back to 2-track video series that we have on our YouTube channel now. That was sort of the impetus to put that whole thing together, because I recognized a lot of it is generational. Keep in mind, coming from 13 years in academia, and I'm not just talking like, okay, I taught grade school or I was teaching. No, I'm like upper level university. It was a top 10 university as far as their film school was concerned.
Nice.
We had credibility, and we had students that wanted to go there to become the best of the best. That's where I did. I wanted to become the best of the best. And quite frequently, I would have to educate the students and remind them that, look, you're coming here to learn a trade, but at the end of the day, what I'm trying to teach you is, in order for me to teach you the proper way to make a good record, you need to know how good records were made originally. Don't expect to be given a Pro Tools license and then you open it up on your software and just start screwing around with it and expect to make a good record. That is a useful tool. And it gets back to what you had said earlier in the conversation, this idea that, well, I can record an iPhone, you know, I can use my iPhone to record something and it's going to be acceptable. I'm not arguing that. Yeah. There's value to that.
Exactly.
We used to call, back in the 80s, we would have those cassette 4 tracks. That's what we used because that's what we had.
I'm so glad you brought that back up, because a lot of people don't know what you mean by back to 2-track.
Yeah, you're right.
And so when you bring up 4-track, it hit me hard because I grew up right in the 90s where that was the commercial hype. Like, you can buy it, you can afford it, you can use it. A couple of my best friends that I grew up with, they love guitar. They're amazing guitar players, DJ and Nick. And hearing them play and then hearing them fall in love with the engineering side of it, it brings me back to that conversation we just had in the coffee room about Rick Rubin and how it's a lot different back in the day to today, and the concepts and the tools are utilized very differently. So going back to just 4-track to back to 2 tracks, right? So the concept of first it was 1 track, which was mono.
Yeah, everything was mono.
Everything was.
In fact, you really want to go there, not to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
It was like it was either direct to disc or what they used to call direct to acetate. Like you literally take a lathe and you grind the thing, and if the band screwed up, you'd throw the record out. All right, here's another one. Try it again.
Was that what
That's
they were
how they
doing
made
on,
records in the 20s and 30s.
Do you remember the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
Yes.
Is that what that was?
Similar idea, but that was more, we'll just say yes. I think that movie kind of took place in the early 30s, and we did have recording technology just on the cusp of that. Because you think about it, I mean, Edison's first Victrola was like in the late 1800s. So it was early 1900s, late 1800s. So recording technology goes way back. We were making recordings long before that period existed. But I'd say the difference is how they were being manufactured or how it was being made.
Got it.
So, I mean, there's a history of people recording on tin cans, you recording on a wire. I mean, we've tried all kinds of different stuff.
I forgot about wire recording. That's actually amazing that you bring that up.
Yeah, it works.
Yeah,
I mean, you
can hear it.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, all you need to do is modulate a stylus into some sort of a medium. And then as long as you have a motor that's spinning the medium at a consistent thing and a stylus to play it back, it'll work.
That's amazing.
You could honestly build your own dang record player if you wanted. It's not that hard. I think the challenge for most people is they just don't have a concept of what goes into not just the creation of the product, but the creation of the content.
Got it.
And as an educator, former educator anyways, that was what I spent so much time trying to focus my energy on teaching the students, is the idea that whether it's 1 track, 2 tracks, 4 tracks, 24 tracks, 48 tracks, 96 tracks, I don't care. Don't put something down if it doesn't belong there, and make sure once you hit record that everything that you need is present in the recording before you proceed. Meaning if it's not ready, don't hit record. How do you know if it's ready? That's called experience. And when you hand a 4-track cassette reel-to-reel or a, even a 4-track Pro Tools rig or something to somebody, at the very least, make sure that the material is rehearsed and it's intelligently thought out. And if you don't know if it's good or not, that's the whole point of involving other people, to help kind of like weigh in on that, say, yeah, I hear stuff.
I love how you put that. I hear stuff.
I hear stuff. Not all good. I sort of, as an aside, I recently just finished mixing a project for somebody, and the project took longer than anticipated, and I had played the recording back, which I knew the problem. I knew the recording had problems to begin with. It wasn't something that I recorded. I had mixed it, but I played the music for some friends of mine who are musicians, not engineers, and they immediately had responded after hearing this track back. They're like, that just sounds bad. Like there's problems all over the place, and why don't you fix it? And I turned to him and said, it's not my song and I didn't engineer it. If I had produced this, none of these problems would, I know they're there, but I don't have the artistic license to go in and start changing people's music. At the end of the day, that's what a producer exists for. The producer is there to make sure that, hey, this isn't good enough. You can't release this.
Yeah, see, that's a great, it's just amazing how the conversation's rolling into a lot of different points I wanted to hit on. Is one, we got to finish up on that. What is a 2-track? But 2,
thank you.
Being able to actually render a product that is of standard, And we say things like standards, right? And I know...
Now, the wonderful thing about standards, there's so many to choose from.
Yeah, and that's something that I know that I have a problem with. And my morality, ethical principalities always fall into the sort of, I want the best. I want to be able to sound the best. I want to be able to produce the best. I want to be able to sound like I'm an intelligent individual. And that's the reason why I did a lot of in-box editing at first, was getting that experience on just basic conversation.
Yeah.
I stutter. Having the MTBIs or PTSDs, I started stuttering heavily. And so one of the things I had to practice on was shut up. Shut your mouth up for a little bit. Run your head a little bit. Like you're saying, get that thing going, get the playing going. And then when you're ready to get the act out or the playing out without, the practice, when you're ready to roll, that's okay. Take notes, hit your points. And that practice actually got me a lot better on having better conversations, because I'm not just filling the gaps with just ums or ats or this or that's or dots or stuttering like, oh, go. Like, it sounds bad. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah, I took college speech class. That was the first thing they beat us up over. Was that kind of filler speech.
Yes, the filler speech or the huns or the, all the thought space within conversation. And it happens. But to be ignorant of it, it's kind of okay nowadays. And that's cool, because you can punch in, you can punch out, you can edit this, you can trim that, and you can do it all in the box. I use Logic Pro because it's the easiest of DAWs for just podcasting. And it's changed a lot nowadays, and the dynamics of recording have changed in the sense of what type of microphones you're using, what type of lines you're using. Is it USB or is it XLR? Is it just tip ring sleeve? What are you putting in? Is it gold? Is it silver? Is it lead? What type of metals are being utilized? Was something that I fell in love with. And then when we were talking, you brought up that piece of equipment, and I can't remember the name of it. And I think that's the one that you told me was the industry standard in the 80s. And I fell in love with the concept of being so polished that you're using a historical vintage piece of equipment to produce something that you can't reproduce in the box. And so going back to the 2 tracks concept, we talked about mono, we talked about wire really quickly. What is the 2 tracks on back to 2 tracks? What does that mean? So
the whole thought of recording back to 2 track, it's not a new thing. And if anything, I'm just rehashing an old idea that great engineers did back in the 60s. But if you study a good way to break it down for your audience who probably don't have the same musical vocabulary that I do, if you go back and listen to the first Beatles albums, for instance, Please Please Me is a great example. That record was recorded straight to mono. Now, I do believe that they had the opportunity on that album to overdub a couple of parts on top of it. But for all intents and purposes, the background tracks that you hear on Please Please Me, it was all recorded with the band playing together in a room together. So that would be an example of something that is just what we call straight to mono. Now, admittedly, EMI or Abbey Road had 4-track recorders. So what they would do back then is they would say, okay, we're going to do a rhythm section, which is the Beatles playing Please Please Me. Then you've got another track where you guys can come in and overdub a vocal. And then maybe we have an extra track or 2 that we can use to overdub a guitar solo or some background vocals or something.
And so that was a way of constructing through dubbing the entire image of what you hear.
Yes.
Okay.
And then what they would do is they would sum those 4 tracks, because nobody had, even if they did, it wouldn't work. People in the consumer world back in the 60s didn't have a 4-track playback device at home. And even if they did, it's like a lot of the mystique and the polish of a record as we know it comes from the creative decisions that the artist and the engineer and the producer make together in the control room when they're making that record. Mm-hmm. So they would sum that 4 tracks. The term that the engineers used at EMI back in the 60s was a reduction. They would reduce, just like you do if you're cooking on a stovetop. You got too much water, what do? You reduce it by boiling the water off. Same thing thing we do when you make beer. So it's the idea of we're going to reduce these 4 tracks down to 1. Well, at one point in the 60s, and I'm sure all of your fans will be familiar with this, EMI America, meaning Capitol, had decided, we want you guys to start using this new stereo thing. We think it's going to catch on. What is stereo? Well, stereo is instead of 1 speaker, it's now we have 2 speakers that are 2 independent channels that are moving completely different directions, or at least can move 2 different directions. So one of the things that they did was they started telling George Martin and Jeff Emmerich, actually, I believe it was pre-Jeff Emmerich. It was one of the, I'm blanking on the name of the first engineer that they used, but they said, look, what we want you guys to do is start doing stereo mixes so we can really push it here in America. So they did 2 sets of mixes. They did a set for the UK, which were mono mixes, and then they did a set of mixes for America that were stereo or 2-track.
Got it.
And that's where you hear the bass and drums in one side and then the vocal and the guitars in the other.
Right.
And we listen back to it today and scratch our heads and go, what were they doing? And the answer George Martin would gave, I don't know. This is some marketing thing. We think it sounds terrible. And he actually routinely objected to this deconstruction of his music because as a producer, he's looking at it like, this is my creative vision of my band. I don't want the record label telling me I have to redo a mix to suit some marketing purposes. This is my mix, my band. I've spent 1 day, 1 month, 1 year, whatever it is in the studio working with these guys creating this work. I don't need your help, EMI America. Thank you. And you'll notice at that point, once stereo really caught on in America, of course, they learned how to use it. And certainly by Sgt. Pepper's, the Beatles really took advantage of the stereo image because they understand stereo doesn't mean that you have to put the drums in the left channel and the bass in the right. It means let's focus on keeping the image between left and right focused in a way where some energy is centric and other energies can be panned left or right in a way that creates motion or width.
Right, because you bring that up, and I think back to exactly what you were saying when there wasn't really a stereo image. It was, drums off of this speaker, vocals and other things off of this speaker, and then maybe something else with the drums. But I think the concept was you're not supposed to be in the center of that stereo image, at least then, probably at that time. And it completely shifted. Like you were saying, by the time Sgt. Pepper came out, there was this concept of how do you get these things to play well with each other? And it introduced a lot of different dynamics of how you record and how you play back something, which is just astonishing because to me, the stereo image provides this landscape that you're engulfed by, which is this image, where mono was you're just in this image. You're in it for the lack of
but it doesn't wrap around you.
Exactly, but you're in it. It's loud, it's good, it's punchy, it's it's wonderful. I noticed that and of course mono mixes there seems to be a lot more substance as far as vocalizations went. And I don't know if that was mixing priorities back in the day or not, but when you got into like stereo imagery, you could fall in love with the way that, of course, I love Pink Floyd.
Oh, who doesn't?
And I remember hearing Pink Floyd for the first time and hearing just the way you're in your head, but you're not. And the music's in your head, but it's not. And it's playing in such a way, it homogenizes this imagination of, oh, wow, it lifts you. The song moves you. The rhythm builds you. And that's when I really started falling in love with music. Not to, cut any other band out there, but that was one of the main ones. And another one that was, I believe it was stereo, but I could be wrong, was Smokey Robinson.
Okay.
Not Tears of a Clown. It was Quiet Storm. Quiet Storm, the way that the whole song begins with just the high pitch going on and then the swirling of that backdrop. I don't know what we call it in the industry, but there's this background of just right, that breathing of the storm coming about. And then the gorgeous voice of Smokey, man. Like I was a kid and that was something that blew me away. How could that sound so amazing? How is it like he's singing to me now instead of just hearing somebody sing? Like you were saying, you hear the noise, but that's what moved me into something that really made music my passion. So going back to 2-track, right? Hearing that stereo mixes are a huge thing, of course. I think the industry is also moving into surround sound or Atmos and what is it, the lossless, you know?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest commercial immersive audio that we have right now would be Atmos because it exceeds 5.1, 7.1, 9.1. It goes beyond that because it's what we call point of source sound. You can effectively set up a grid of speakers in a space and put an object, is actually the term they use in audio. You can put an object in any speaker you want. And of course, the problem, and this is where Dolby gets involved, is they have some pretty heavy encoders that do the math on that because the problem is how do you translate different speaker routings to different rooms with different speaker matrices, and it gets complicated. But without going there just yet, because I didn't quite answer the question of what is the meaning of back to 2-track as it applies in this situation here, I think I articulated well enough the concept of what stereo recording is. It's what we would call 2-channel audio, but the thing that we're trying to do with our back to 2-track here at dBu Ranch is to demonstrate, okay, there's an art to capturing music. We've established that. There's an art to playing music. We've established that. What if we eliminated, in this situation, the art of tinkering with the music? Because there's an art to that as well. I mean,
that's a very good point.
I've made artful records tinkering and going in and screwing around with stuff. But what if we remove that variable and said, okay, there's an art of the performance, there's an art of the capture, and then that's it. It goes into the ether. It's finished. It can no longer be modified. It can't be tampered with. It is it's what I like to refer to as lightning caught in the bottle.
Right.
It's like, I got it. It's right here. We can see it. We can experience it together, but it's done. There shall be no going back and tinkering or tampering. That was a concept of back to 2-track. It is a live recording of a real band in a real studio that is being filmed and put together simultaneously so that we sort of have this composite, if you will, of video and audio of this performance that's happening. And as I said, it's nothing novel. I mean, people have been doing this forever. I can easily name off the top of my head 2 or 3 other people that are doing the same thing. What sets this particular back to 2-track thing apart from Daryl's House and NPR, and somebody turned me on to something last night that is very similar to what I'm doing. I'd never even seen it before, but it's more on a jazz level. Really impressive stuff. What I am doing differently is the focus is on capturing high quality audio. We're running this through a front end that very few studios can afford or justify running it through, namely a Neve console and a Studer tape machine. We're actually going through a significant amount of classic technology for purposes of capturing a sound. So it's not just like performance capture, it's like performance capture, but using the best equipment available for that kind of music.
Right.
As opposed to, if you study how they did Daryl's House, the guy had racks of preamps and some decent microphones. He wasn't using a Neve. He may have used some Neve modules, but he wasn't doing the whole thing. And they were more focused on capturing music with a band live in a room. The focus wasn't like, we're going to capture this incredible sound through all this vintage gear to show this is how good it can be.
Right.
And if you listen to NPR Tiny Desk is a great example, the sound is awful. They're using the same mic that I'm using here to talk.
Yeah,
like,
I noticed that in a few of their I get it's just performances, right? Not a concert or a mini concert, literally called Mini Desk. I don't know most people that haven't heard of that yet, but it's one of those very unique structures. It's kind of like being in a room that shouldn't be used for recording,
so true.
and set up in a way that shouldn't work, but it works. It gives you a different vibe. It's something playful. It's something unique. And when I was talking to you about your Neve, and that's something we glossed over, was the Studer and the Neve, which are two remarkable pieces of equipment. The Neve, like we talked about SSL, that was your goal when you were a young man.
It was my dream board.
You wanted to get behind an SSL, and to kind of plug SSL, I was finally able to afford and get myself a little SSL plus 2. And everybody that's listening that doesn't know, it just puts you in a different room or a different way of collecting your recording. And it's nothing fancy. This is only like $290, $300. And if you're getting into it, that's nothing for an SSL, right? Like,
back in the day, just so
Yeah.
you listeners know, those things were anywhere from $750,000 to $1 million.
Jesus Christ.
They were giant consoles that cost a lot of money. I mean, you could get cheaper ones, of course, but back in the 90s, it was all about more inputs. If you nobody in their right mind would order a 48 input SSL because it's like, what are you going to do with that? Like, that's too small.
What?
Well, it's like $350,000, or do you want to pay double for 96 inputs? Yeah, we'll spend double. We'll go ahead and spend $750,000.
Now
So you're right, $300
to get an SSL. It's remarkable.
We've come a long way.
Yeah, and in fact, me and my kids were laughing because they didn't understand what I was saying, and I was just gushing about it. I was like, man, my wife's finally let me get an SSL. I had to replace my interface anyways, and this is where I really feel like they did a great job marketing it, because you can get into an SSL. It has the 4K uptick. It has the the warmth and everything you could imagine. It's not 100%. Okay, don't get me wrong.
Their emulations are good.
Yes,
I'll leave it at that.
Yes, and so we went to the I think it's ASCAP. That's the big thing that they do up in Anaheim, right?
Oh, a NAM show.
NAM.
AES and NAM.
Yes.
It used to be AES and NAM were different, but then AES started getting some.
Well, they have a
nosebleeds.
museum right over by, and this was one of the day trips that we took to Legoland, and I was like,
oh, I've been to the one down in Carlsbad.
Yes.
Yes.
So they have like a museum right there about all the music stuff. I think it is, I can't remember what's the name of the museum, but my kids we were looking at all these different pieces of equipment and all this stuff, and one of the things they had was a Neve. Like, it was a Neve, like it was locked up in its museum grade
case. Yeah.
And you're not allowed to touch, you can't go near it. And so to me, it's remarkable that we are sitting in front of a Neve, and I know that you can give me more of a breakdown of this piece of equipment and where you got it, like what its history was, but to touch on, of course, the vintage or antique equipment, for a lot of our listeners that hear music on commercial grade reproduction, or consumer grade reproduction, I should say. Of course, I'm not trying to tout, go out there and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars if you're, just getting into the industry of audio engineering. What I'm saying is, you can literally initiate or start your journey at any level, and you can get into a piece of equipment like an SSL relatively cheap now, and you could even break into the concepts that we were discussing so far with even back to 2 tracks, where you're not just trying to capture a moment, you're trying to capture a moment and shine the brightest, most polished light onto what you were doing, or I shouldn't say you, but your musicians, your talent, the artists. And that's something that is so missed out on today, especially on reproduction. I shouldn't say reproduction, but on major things like on Spotify or, the cloud stuff app thingies and whatnot, and I'm just totally sounding like an old guy right now. But somebody asked me if I had a calendarini or a calandini thing. I'm setting up another guest right now, and I just was very blunt. I don't know what that appy thingy is you're talking about, lady, but I have a regular calendar and I can schedule these dates. And so it's wonderful that all of these things exist, but without history, without the context of the history of equipment, the history of engineers, and being able to encapsulate and create a gorgeous sounding recording. Now, the Studer, that's what it's called, correct?
Yeah, Studer.
What type of what is it that goes into utilizing that for a live performance? Is it a single piece of tape, or what type of millimeter of tape?
So that's actually a really good question. In fact, I was waiting for somebody to call me out on that, because an educated engineer would say, wait, if it's live to 2-track, your Studer, which is an 827, is a 2-inch 24-track. Are you recording everything stereo to 2 tracks on the tape machine? Well, where's the advantage of that? Because the tape width is so low that you're not going to get any sonic benefit from mixing to that format. You would use a studio master recorder, which I do have, but they're currently in the shop, like a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch stereo machine. So I was waiting for someone to call me out on this. To be clear, the way the room is wired, we're recording through the Studer's electronics, but for back to 2-track, we're not actually printing to the tape machine, because it would immediately defy what we're setting out to do, which is capture this inertia in a bottle. It's like, I got it, it's here. And if I record it to tape, well, then it exists and it's capturable. Right. If that makes sense. The goal was like, no, I want to capture just a stereo recording of the band playing together in a room, which means, by the way, I have to mix it live. So, excuse me, I'm no longer acting as a recording engineer. I'm acting very much like a front of house or a broadcast engineer.
I love that you brought that up.
It's a total different. So my focus is like, I got to mix it right, because they can get a perfect performance. But if I screw it up, we have to start over again. And if I get a perfect performance, like I nailed it, I did it all the moves and everything right, and they screwed up, it's like, guess what? We get to do it again. And it has come up in some of these back to 2 tracks where they'll come in and listen to performance. And they're like, yeah, is there any way we could punch in and fix that one note? Well, yeah, but no. That's not the point of what we're doing here.
Exactly.
The point is to leave the flaws in place or get it right. So in the midst of trying to do this, it kind of became clear to me, I have to educate the artist. This is not a recording session. This is a traditional, you're walking in where we're doing a live recording to a stereo machine. Now, the machine in this case is going straight into Pro Tools, because I'm using Pro Tools as my capture machine. Once I get my tape recorder back, it's conceivable we may start tracking to tape itself, although I honestly don't see the benefit, because for it to be usable, I have to encode it to digital anyways,
right.
Because the distribution platform that we know today is digital.
Right.
So it almost makes sense to continue to capture from the stereo bus into Pro Tools itself. But all of the microphones themselves actually go through the Neve. They're routed through all this outboard hardware that you see here. It's routed through the path of the Studer and then dumps into the inputs of Pro Tools. So there's a cascading effect that's happening. So we're very much capturing the sound of the Studer, because the electronics on the Studer itself has a sound to it, aside from the tape.
Right.
And I would almost go so far as to argue the sound of the Studer electronics have more of an influence on the sound than the tape itself does.
Really?
And a lot of people don't realize that. There's this sort of misnomer that, oh, well, I've got a, recording to tape, it's going to sound better. Not necessarily. I mean, you could record to tape on a really crappy machine, and at the end of the day, you've got yourself a great tape recording of crappy electronics. And
Right.
that's what we're trying to avoid here, is you have the best machine in San Diego, as far as I know, because I don't know anybody else that has a high-end Studer. You got the best machine coupled with the best tape machine, the best console. And as one guy came in here a year ago and he took one look, he's like, dude, do you realize what you have here? You've got the muscle car of Pro Audio, as he's looking at the Neve, combined with the Rolls Royce of Pro Audio. And I'm like, that's such a great analogy, because it's true.
Yeah,
like this is a GTO. You're staring at it, man. You want to tear up the driveway? This will do it.
Yeah.
And if you want something that's just going to make you sound slick and super polished and give you that really kind of a, like, we are for real, the high class thing, that's what the Studer does.
See, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because especially when you come to the conversation of front of house, live performance, and you're doing a live mix, if you mess up,
It's on me.
It's on you. And if the band mess up, it's a thing that it's a team. It's a teamwork that gets the mission accomplished, so to speak, right? And one of the best shows, let me just go ahead and plug this guy because I hope to be able to get him on one day. I don't know his name, but his Instagram is Soundman USA. And he's been with Neo for so long that when my second son, I should say, was still in my wife's tummy, we went to go see Neo at a meet and greet at now the destroyed Disney Walk House of Blues.
Oh, I didn't know that was gone.
Yeah, no, they
blew it down.
Gone. Yeah, and that was one of my favorite venues to go to.
I actually had been there a few times.
It is such a fun venue, and I mean, honestly, of course, with Disney there and the walk and everything, but we went to go see Nino, right? Oh my God. Neo, and we got to meet him, do the meet and greet, and he rubbed the belly and everything. It was so adorable. My wife was just elated. She is the super fan of Neo. We're probably going to go see it. Well, we are. She bought the tickets at the Greek this month or next month, actually, in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And, well, this gentleman, I just couldn't focus on Neo. I couldn't. The show was amazing. All right. They did the preliminary, the opening guests, and they used the house equipment, which was not good at all.
Yeah.
And then they brought in this guy and Neo's guys and ladies and everybody else that's going on to this production. The moment they turned on his equipment, I was flabbergasted. I was blown away. Of course, I was a few beers deep, but I could not take my eyes off of his live mix. The way this dude was mixing and just going into the rhythms, the sounds, there wasn't a missed beat. There wasn't an overtone. There was nothing imperfect about this thing. It was so amazing that after the show, I squatted around and I was looking for the dude. I saw him walking with two beautiful ladies, right?
Lucky him.
Yeah, lucky him. And I said, dude, that was the best show I've ever seen mixed. And he was like, what are you talking about? Why were you paying attention to me? I'm like, I was just in audio engineering school at the time. And I said, this has got to be the most mind-blowing performance I ever seen an engineer do. Like, he goes, thank you, man. We shook hands and went our ways. It was, late in the evening. But to this day, and I saw him again at Neo at the casino, Sequan, I think it's called.
Okay.
And still amazing. I didn't get a meet and greet that time.
Yeah, but you said he's still there.
Still there, still going on tour at Neo, still doing all this great stuff. But you bring into that conversation of live performance where the engineer and the artist are literally one.
They're tied together.
Yeah.
It's very much a three-legged race.
Yeah, thank you for putting it that way. That's a perfect analogy. It's a three-legged race. Now, moving forward to focusing on why is Neve such a reputable piece of equipment? How is something like this attainable? And for an artist that may not, have, the chops, so to speak, what would this provide an artist on the turnaround for booking and getting their record produced somewhere like here at dBu Ranch?
Lots of questions. Start first. Your first question, which is more to do with the history. How did this particular console versus the brand itself come into existence? Rupert Neve started out in the 60s as a stereo repairman. He just kind of repaired home stereos and speakers. And at one point in the late 60s, he started designing some electronics for local studios because they needed small mixing consoles. And that's sort of where he got his start. And somewhere out there, although I have not seen it, I've heard a rumor that there is actually a tube-based Neve console. It's really small. I think it was like a 6-channel thing, but allegedly it exists. I imagine it sounds really cool and it would be really neat. Rupert kind of realized really quickly in the late 60s that he couldn't get the performance he wanted out of tubes. So he started looking into transistors. And this is back in the day when transistors were still discrete. Discrete doesn't mean much to your listeners, but an example of a discrete circuit would be a single transistor with 3 legs on it, which you'd see in a lot of your old gear back in the 70s. Discrete circuits have a specific sound because of the way that they recreate the waveform. tubes perform very similarly. The difference is when we started moving into Class A, B, and non-discrete circuitry, like we would refer to silicon chips, the integrated circuit is what I'm saying. Integrated circuits, which we find in technology post 1975. The sound was dramatically different because there's what we call crossover distortion between if you picture a sine wave, if you will, you've got a pure sine wave with a tube, and then with a transistor, you have a pure sine wave as well. The problem is when you use dual power supplies, it kind of, as a signal goes up and then comes to that crossover point, what we would know in math, the sort of zero axis, and then it starts to go down again, there's a break there. And they have different ways of trying to minimize that distortion, but at the end of the day, you get that distortion. And that's just the reality of how that type of circuit works.
Okay.
So Neve was one of the guys that kind of realized early on, I'm going to leave the tube world behind and I'm going to develop this discrete console. And what you're seeing here is a board that was built in 1972, so it's not that long after Rupert Neve and Company opened as a business. Because I don't think he started producing consoles as a business until the early 70s. So you could argue this is one of the first consoles to roll off of the Neve line. This one was actually commissioned by and for Syracuse University back in the 70s. And as I understand it, it lived there up until one point where it ended up being sent to a private studio in Ojai.
Wow, hold on. So to focus in on what you just said, because I don't want that to go kind of unrecognized. Syracuse University was using this for I don't know what. I don't know what universities would do with stuff like this. What would that entail?
That's a good question. I don't know. And I don't know enough about Syracuse's program back in the 70s to know if it was part of a media program. I don't know if it was used as a tool in the creation of school content. It's hard to know.
Or even engineering, electrical engineering, perhaps?
It's kind of doubtful. This, to me, stands like it was part of a production facility. Now, what they were producing with it, I don't know.
Okay.
They may have had a campus recording studio. It would have been pretty far ahead of its time because not that many schools had recording schools at that point. The first recording school that I know of kind of hit in the mid to late 70s, and that was Soundmasters Recording Academy in LA. That was like the first real recording school. So my personal belief is that it was being used as a production console for content that the university was creating for the university. I don't know if it was part of a media arts program, but it's hard to know.
Okay.
What is interesting about this is that you got to look at it in the context of the time. So this is a 16-channel console, and roughly during the time this console was built, 16 channels was probably... It would have been considered, in 1972, it would have been considered pretty cutting edge. I do know some studios that around the same time frame purchased 24 input desks, which would have an extra bucket on it, an extra bucket of 8. So it's, for what they were doing, I'm surprised that they ponied up to get 16 channels.
Nice.
It's really, it kind of bends the mind to think that that's what happened. How it ended up in my hands is a little bit...
So you said you brought up the Ojai private studio.
Yeah, so it was initially in Ojai at a studio that a lot of artists in the 70s and 80s did some recording. I've heard rumors that Fleetwood Mac recorded there. I know that Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros did some recording there 10 years ago. This was a studio that's had a lineage, a history of hits, and it was owned by this eccentric guy who bought all his gear that he picked up around the world and kind of kept it there until the 2000s. And then around 2005, he ended up putting everything up for sale. I think he was getting out of the business and he was going to sell the building or get out of his lease or whatever had happened. And he sold it to John Ondrasik. This and most of the gear, not all of it, but a good chunk of the equipment, which was all vintage stuff, he sold it to John because John Ondrasik, who, if your listeners are not familiar with him, he is actually, I'm sure a lot of your listeners, because they're military or ex-military, probably do know John because he's a huge USO supporter. Like, he goes and plays to the troops, huge supporter of the troops, does shout-outs to the troops all the time, does benefit performances for the troops. He loves American troops, big troop supporter. He ended up buying this to do the record Two Lights. And he didn't want the console. He wanted the actual modules in the console, which is kind of a thing that started happening around the late 90s, where people would buy the console, they would gut the audio modules and throw the consoles out. And he did just that. He gutted it, but he didn't actually throw the board away. He just put all the electronics in storage and forgot about it. And he made Two Lights using a lot of that gear, and I helped them interface and set everything up at the studio where they made that record. Hence my connection to John.
Got it.
And the records that I've helped him with subsequent to Two Lights. Anyway, long story short, about 7, 8 years, almost 10 years ago, he said, Dusk, I want to sell off some of my gear because we're done with Two Lights. I'm not going to be using it for any more records. If I want to make a record, I'll just go to a studio. Okay, fine. I started looking at the gear, and immediately I had asked the question, dude, you've got a Neve in storage. Something's wrong with that. Like, this thing should be in a studio.
Yeah.
And he looked at me with this really kind of deadpan expression, like, yeah, it's just kind of there. Do you want it? I was like, John, like, I know what this is, and I know I can't afford it. And he was like, well, I wasn't offering it to you to have. I was just offering it to you to, take care of until I decide to sell it. And I said, absolutely. I would really welcome the opportunity to get to know the board and to learn it, because I hadn't really worked on a vintage Neve prior to that, like maybe once or twice. So I'm like, I actually would really be into that idea. So they're like, great, I'll have it delivered to your house tomorrow. And it literally showed up in a cube truck the next day, and these two guys with a liftgate and dollies pushed it right up to my house. I was like, oh my God, I have a Neve. And it was really a weird, sort of surreal moment, because on one hand, my entire life I wanted a Neve, and then it just fell into my lap. It literally fell into my lap. And I spent the next couple of years working on it, getting to know it, fixed it, cleaned it up. We did a lot of little repairs, polished it. And at one point, John had came to the house where I had it in L.A., because I had his studio in the back of the house, or in my detached garage. And he said, man, this board ended up in the right place. I'm glad that you have it. And I kind of winked at him and said, well, for now. Because I knew that I knew the day was going to come.
Yeah.
He approached me about 4 or 5 years later and said, look, I need to sell it. I need to get my money out of it. Is there any way I can get you to buy it? And I'm like, John, I don't think I got the money. I was going to work. And we probably went back and forth with each other for 4 or 5 months. And at one point, I had spoken to my wife and said, I think it would be a giant mistake to let this console slip through my fingers, because I'll never get one again.
No.
And if I do,
it won't be in this condition. Yeah, it's like buying a classic car. That's why when you brought it up, I was like, you hit the nail on the head for a guy that's been looking at 65 Mustangs for about a year now.
Yeah, it's the same thing. Yeah. Ironically, he owns a 65 Mustang.
Of course. Why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't he? Well, yeah. Maybe me and him can talk a little bit about that thing then. But also the fact that you don't want this gorgeous piece of equipment that, regardless if it's been sitting in the garage or in storage forever, something that to you is just beyond, it's not beyond money. Let's be realistic, right? It's hard to purchase, hard to get in, hard to maintain, hard to find a good sales point. Like you're saying, it took months, right?
Yeah.
And to be able to come to the conversation of, well, I know, like he said, I know this board got to the right hands.
He said that so many times. And when it actually, I have an email from him that when I sent him the final check to pay it off, he says, congratulations on owning a Neve. I know it went to a good place. Because he knew 2 things. One, like we were talking about with your car, I could have turned around that day, sold it, flipped it, and made a fortune.
Yeah.
And he also knew I have no interest in that.
Yep.
I'm not after the board for money. I own it because this is, for me, it's an asset that I use for making art.
That's so awesomely put. Asset. Yeah. Like, honestly, it's like a huge investment.
My tableau, or whatever you call it, the artist's little thing with colors. It's my palette. This is my palette. Like, this is what I use to make paint. And in this case, instead of using ones and zeros and colors on a screen or like actual oil paints on a canvas, this is my canvas. I mean, of course, I paint it to the media, which is either tape or Pro Tools, but these are my colors, and this is what I use to create sound. So
that's awesome that you put that way, because there are warms and brights of every color. There's shades of grays within all dynamics of colors, right? There's different palettes for different people. Some like, opaque, or the pastels, or, the brights and the beautiful neons and everything else that goes with it. It's amazing that you brought that up, because it brings us into the Studer. Like, to capture something not only on this piece of equipment, which is the Neve, and having somebody believe that you more than likely look up to as, of course, either a mentor or a person that, you have a great relationship with, that that you got their stud of a car over here, right?
Yeah.
And it's going into great hands. There's this, lack of fear that it's going to be, just either parted out or destroyed or flipped or whatever it is. How did that go about with the Studer then?
So back to 4th Street Recording, the first time I actually heard a high-end Studio Master recorder, it was a Studer, actually A800, which is Mark III, which is a generation before that. And the first time I heard the sound come off the heads of that machine, I was blown away. I was just like, coming from an Otari, coming from ADAT, and then at that point Pro Tools, and having heard all these different conversion systems and ways of capturing audio, I kind of was like, okay, that's sound. That's my bass, if you will. Like, okay, here's where I'm coming from as a bass line. And then when I stepped into a room with a Studer, there was this immediate like, what is that sound? Where is it coming from? Even through a crappy Soundcraft console, I heard it was like, what is that? And I learned right away, oh, it's a Studer. That's what that machine does. Like Willie Studer back in the 40s created this stuff, and he's a genius electronically. He figured out how to make this great sound. And by the time I got to 4th Street and they had an 827, I was familiar with the sound, and I started throwing, I was throwing stuff up on the tape deck and hitting record and playing it back. I'm like, man, that sound is just so rich. It's rich. It's just glossy and rich. And I've never heard it on any of the other machines that I had used before that. So I told myself, by the time I left Record Plant and went into post-production, there will be a day in the future where I will buy one of these machines for myself. Now, mid to late 90s, Studers were going, particularly the 827s, they were selling anywhere between $35,000 and $50,000, depending on how many hours and the condition and all that. New machines were retailing in the late 90s for $60K plus.
Wow.
They were brand new I think somebody told me like the gold edition sold for $65, and they only made a handful of those. So I was like, I'll never be able to afford one of these machines. It's not going to happen. So I became a broker in 2000 and actually left audio. I didn't say I left it altogether, but I left the production business and became focused on, okay, my career path's going to meander because I love gear. I'm going to learn everything I can about gear. So I got involved with an equipment brokerage that brokered studio and live sound equipment. I really learned what was going on.
I'm glad that you explained that, because I was like, broker?
Yeah, I brokered what we would call broadcast and recording equipment. Was what I did. I learned really quickly I wasn't a sales guy, because a sales guy is going to tell you, hey, you need to buy this because it's going to make me the most profit. I was the opposite, saying you don't want to buy that because it's a piece of garbage. You want to buy this. Well, that costs too much money. Well, I understand, but you're getting a better buy with this, and here's the reasons why.
Yeah.
So my boss at the time had kind of educated me, like, dude, you're a terrible salesperson because you're selling people on the wrong product. You're never going to make money at this if this is what you want to do. And I realized after 2 years I didn't. But I remember telling myself at one point, I started seeing Studer 2-inch decks dropping like rocks. The market was going like 35 down to 25, 25 down to 19, 19 down to like 15. It was at the point where I'm like, this is crazy. These machines are worth way more than that. And I even remember talking to a mentor of mine. I'm like, dude, the first time I see one of these things hit $5,000, I'm buying it. And he's like, go ahead, it'll be a boat anchor at that point. And I said, it'll never be a boat anchor because it's like, they sound awesome. And he's like, what good is it going to do you if you can't buy tape? I said, I don't care.
That's a great point.
I'll keep baking tape if that's what I have to do to make it work. When tape goes bad, it gets sticky. And when it gets sticky, you have to bake it to bake the moisture out of it so you can keep recording
So you're literally baking it?
Yeah, it goes in my oven. It's a convection oven. It's all this crazy stuff you have to do to keep it working. And of course, there's still guys making tape. But I have to admit, Ampex, 3M, BASF, all the big manufacturers got out of it because they realized they could sell more P-touch labeling and the adhesive Post-it notes than they could in high-end recording tape, which had a significant investment in machining and technology and chemicals. Not to mention the quality control for tape is like, it's on a scientific level. It's got to be perfect. Like if they screw up some P-touch tape or you screw up a little bit of the little Post-it notes, like who gives a squat? Like whatever.
Yeah.
So they sold it all off because they knew it was a problem. I didn't care. And there was a point around 2010 where one of the studios that I have a relationship with in LA, I just happened to pick up the phone one day and called my friend and said, any chance you guys have any 827s you want to sell? He says, we have 3, actually. I'm like, any chance you'll take $5,000 for it? And he said, well, we'll think about it. And he went and spoke to the owner, and the guy called back. He's like, we'll do it. And I showed up the next day with a truck and $5,000. I'm like, it's mine. I'm leaving before you change your mind.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, they were just glad to get rid of it. I should have bought the second one, but I didn't have a place to put it. And then, of course, fast forward to now, after Foo Fighters put out Wasting Light, which was cut on a Studer, again, like they did their first record, the Color and the Shape. After they did that, they stopped doing tape and they did everything in Pro Tools because Pro Tools sounds like crap. And they said, hey, let's try and make a record again on tape the way that we used to, just as a gimmick. And they did, and then tape kind of caught on again. And then more and more over the last decade, there's been this sort of adoption of reusing tape as a format because it does have a cool sound. Now, I personally, as I said, I believe it has more to do with the machine than the formula of the tape, and I've kind of come to believe that. But let's admit it, tape does have a sound. It sounds way better than Pro Tools, and there's a million reasons for it. But at the end of the day, you get a much better sound. So that was how I ended up with the machine. It was just one of those things where I drove home in a cube truck with this machine, smiling the whole way, laughing, and like
just ear to ear grin.
I knew. I was like, dude, this machine's going to be worth $10,000 in 5 years. And I just spoke to a broker that I know in Los Angeles who sells and installs studio level equipment 3 or 4 months ago because I was looking to get some parts for the machine. And the guy had said, yeah, we just in the process of refurbishing an 827 with a remote. I said, just out of curiosity, what are you guys asking for it? It's like, around 15. So I've seen the value of this machine go up $10,000 in the last several years by doing nothing. And I predicted that was going to happen. I knew that these machines were going to go back up. And a lot of tape machines have gone back up in value. Even little consumer tape decks have gone up in value because people are kind of waking up to, yeah, I can record music or whatever it is, my project, in the box, using that expression, but it's missing something. Well, yeah, it's missing your sound, the character of the sound. Pro Tools, and I don't mean to knock it, it's great when you're producing a blockbuster film, and it's great when you're producing a record where you want everything to sound super sterile and have no life to it. But if you want something that feels like there's some tangibility to it and that there's a little bit of meat to the sound, tape absolutely will corrupt your sound. That's the whole reason we stopped using it, because we realize it's going to screw with your sound. And it's a pain in the butt to deal with. You don't just hand a tape machine, especially something like that, over to a novice and say, have at it. It requires a lot of knowledge, a lot of training, some understanding of chemistry and physics. You've got to have an understanding of electronics. So it's not for everyone. But once you know the machine and you understand how to use it and you understand how to exploit it for musical purposes, hence the marriage of the Neve and the Studer, you can create sounds that we haven't heard in 30 years, which is why I believe there has been this movement back towards vinyl. People are like, oh, I want to hear this because there's something there that I don't hear on my crappy MP3. Yeah, you're right. It's called expression.
Yeah.
It has been removed by your converters.
Yeah, I love that you put you bring up the MP3 that you lose. So bringing back the conversation about MP3, or I should say the expression, like you were saying.
Yeah.
Right. So you bring up vinyl, bring up tape. We've talked a lot even about wires and stuff like that, right? But to talk about MP3, which is the primary format that a lot of people utilize, it is, you know, the market is kind of breaking out into wave and MP4, like higher end reproductions of, you know, digital crap. Right.
The codex is a term that we use.
So on MP3, you lose an amount of stuff. And I don't know if I may be wrong in this. It has to do with the bit rate.
Well, it's a complex encoding thing, but to help sort of articulate your question, which is MP3 has been a standard that we use for encoding, particularly audio. MP4 is just a way of encoding video and audio together.
Okay.
So the question being, you know, I'm assuming, or at least I'm reading into your question, is there, as we progress technologically, is there a reason for us to improve those encoding formats to make them better? If I'm interpreting your question.
Yeah, but then the main reason why is if we could just go back in time, which we had, like you were talking about with vinyl, and utilize vinyl more, but a lot of people are probably using digital information to create that vinyl.
That's one of my beefs with vinyl, by the way. And there's two separate issues. One I'll tackle very briefly, which is the first one. Is MP3 still a valid or a valuable format or codec? The short answer is yes and no. I mean, I still use MP3 because it's easy to send around. I use MP3s when I'm sending rough mixes to clients and just what we would call dailies, if you will, because it's easy. My software works with it. Their software reads it. The Fraunhofer Institute, which is the company or the corporation in Germany that created the MP3 codec 20 some odd years ago, has recently, I think within the last 5 years, said, we're actually not supporting this codec. We've got a new one. You should use that instead. And that's where you've seen some of these newer codecs, the Apple lossless converter, the FLAC, and then there's 2 or 3 other codecs that have sort of come out over the last few years that are superior to the MP3 codec. So really the MP3 is outdated and we probably should get in the habit of doing away with it. This is me speaking as a practitioner who is dispensing advice like a father would to his own kid, recognizing, yeah, I probably shouldn't curse. So it's bad.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, yeah, I should stop
There's
using
ways
MP3.
of improving, step by step.
Now, fortunately for me, my excuse is supported by the fact that I'm still working on an old Pro Tools system that doesn't support the newer codecs. And I'm not even going to get into why I'm using the old system. Suffice it to say I'm stuck with it for now. Now, getting into the argument of using a wave as a regular thing, I've actually argued this, and I think we're at the point now where the bit rate and the bandwidth of moving audio, we're probably not that far off from us being able to manage streaming wave files on a regular level. I think that this is something that we are probably not that far off because we're streaming high bandwidth video, which includes audio, and that takes far more number crunching than waves, which is just even like on a high quality wave file, which is 4824. I mean, that's like high quality. The standard for the Redbook, the Philips Sony digital standard that was written back in 1984 or whatever it was, is 44.116. So that standard is good enough, which is still considered by today's standard CD quality sound. The question is, do we need better than CD quality sound? I would argue for broadcast purposes, no. Broadcast standard is 4816, so they want a higher sample rate, but they're still fine with the existing bit depth. Okay, fine, let them have that. Still, it's not enough of a change to the data pipe, if you will, that we have to worry about the difference of that extra 8 8, if you will. I mean, but the difference between 44, that's not even 8. It's like an additional 4,000 samples a second or something like that. It's not really worth getting into a pissing match over. Now, to move to your other question, which was, is there something to be gained by moving our content to vinyl? Particularly something that has been initially digitized. I actually have a firm belief that people that are taking existing content that was recorded digitally, meaning the music was recorded to a digital format straight from a microphone, even if it went through an analog console, is there a benefit to taking that content that was captured digitally, manipulated digitally, mixed digitally, ported to a mastering process that was mastered digitally, and then taking that, sending it to an analog process or an analog factory that's going to now take those ones and zeros and convert them to analog waveforms that gets cut, or if you will, pressed to vinyl? Is there an advantage to be gained there? I've actually done some tests that most people have not had the opportunity to do, and I have, where I've digitally mastered records before, or in this case, one record that I mastered several years ago. I did the digital master and gave it to the client. He took the same files that I used to master his files and sent them to a facility that created a vinyl product. And I've been able to synchronize the record and the actual content that I created, and after they're level matched, I can't necessarily say that I have a preference for the vinyl product over what I created. Now, the problem with this process, and this is what I think a lot of lay people don't understand with vinyl, they believe that there is some intrinsic value to the media that you don't get in digital, without understanding how the two different medias were created to begin with. Both medias require a mastering engineer. This is not software, lest you believe that software can do a good job mastering, because I know some websites out there, Lander being one of them, this belief that, well, we can program software to do it. No, you can't. Anybody that believes that is off their rocker and clearly hasn't studied mastering on a scientific level. So I will absolutely discount websites like Lander, and to a certain extent, there are other websites where it's like, oh, well, we'll give you robotic control over our mastering equipment and you can master it yourself using our high quality equipment. Great. That would be like me walking into, I don't know, Pep Boys or Firestone Auto Center and saying, all right, guys, I'm here. I'm going to use all your tools to fix my own car.
Yeah.
I wouldn't know the first thing to do. I mean, I can change my oil. I probably change, I might be able to switch out my radiator, maybe.
Rotate the tires.
That I can do. Yeah, and I know.
Lose the 10mm socket.
Yeah. But at one point, I have to acknowledge that even with the right tools, there's a lot of jobs I just can't do because I don't know how to use them.
Yeah.
So I will dispense with this nonsense and I will use this in the most nasty way possible. I will dispense with this nonsensical idea that you can master your own material, or that you can use some guy in his bedroom who's got like a laptop and some stolen plugins to master. Joke. Stupid.
I love that.
I would go hire a dentist, that I would go take dentist tools and do my own dentistry. The dumbest thing in the world. My belief or my guess is that if you spoke to your dentist and asked him, who does your dental work? Do you do it yourself? He might say, I do some stuff, but at the end of the day, if he's got like to do a root canal, I'm assuming he's hiring another dentist to do his dentistry.
Right.
You don't operate on yourself any more than I would operate on my own self. So I would, at the end of the day, I hire a mastering engineer to master my own stuff, even though I can do it. So taking that back to this question about mastering for vinyl versus mastering for CD, or for that matter, any other codec that's going out on streaming or whatever, regardless of the destination, the big question needs to be, would you expect to hear a difference in the outcome of a product if you gave that same product to two different people and said, master it? Well, yeah, I could give the same product to two different people who are mastering the CD and the product's going to sound different. By definition, because there's two different people and they don't share the same brain, the same experiences, the same ears, you're going to get a different product. So, of course, giving something that was sent to vinyl, coming from the same digital file, can I expect that if I send it to an analog guy who's working with vinyl, would I expect to get something different if it's gone to digital, i.e. CD or to a streaming format? Well, of course it's going to be different because you have two different humans doing it. And for all you know, the guy who's doing the vinyl stuff may not have nearly the same experience in making records and mastering records that I do making records and mastering digital records. I mean, I've got 30 plus years of experience. For all I know, the guy who's doing my record has been mastering records vinyl for what, 5 or 10 years?
Yeah.
I don't know. I have no idea.
See, and that's something that I think kind of ties into this whole story, or I should say the whole show so far. And of course, we can talk all day.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and we haven't even started talking about beer yet. So, I mean, the biggest concept that I'm hearing is it's not necessarily the tools, the studio. It could be. It can
It
be.
helps.
It helps, yes. I mean, of course, it helps to have a floor jack instead of,
Yeah, you're
just your
absolutely right.
basic little windy ones that you have in your kit car, or your car kit, I should say, to fix your own tire. Of course, it helps to have the right tools, but it also helps to know when to use the right tools and have those right tools and the supplementation that goes with them. Like if you have a pneumatic air gun and you don't have an air compressor, you don't have a pneumatic air gun. You can hold on to it all you want.
Look at it.
Yeah,
It's cool.
great. Oh, look how pretty, right? And so when you're tying into kind of the basis of our entire conversation here is having a want, right? Having a vision, of course, with dBu Ranch, it kind of ties into the whole conversation of what I'd like to bring to our guests and our listeners is not only being able to hear the difference, but experience the differences of what's out there and what's available in the world today. We didn't even discuss the loudness wars.
I could go on for a good 20 minutes on that alone.
And that's a great conversation to have because to me, it's something that I know is valuable, but sharing something to people, our listeners, our community with the Devil Dog Talk Show and with the dBu Ranch and back to 2 Tracks, it's allowing the opportunity for conversations for people to realize that there's better ways, better habits, better techniques, and better engineers. And that doesn't mean what everybody has now is either good, bad, or different. It just means that the opportunity to have that conversation can shine light on this very great opportunity. So if listeners have the opportunity to, let's say they got a band, right? And they're like, man, my dream, like your dream, was to start out and become the best engineer. Their dream is to produce the best guitar riffs. Their dreams, the best sounding snare drum, which I didn't know, which is a huge engineer's like nightmare. What head, what material, who made it, what manufacturer, what microphone, what line XLR, what are you using to capture this? It's a whole event just to capture that moment, right? And to me, being able to share light and shed light on this amazing facility and yourself, which is I'm blown away constantly whenever we have our conversations, and to have the breakdown, like you were saying, you can have an MP3 that doesn't.
It works.
It works, yeah. It doesn't.
Can't argue with the science.
Exactly. It's there. You can hear it, right? And I always go back and forth with my wife on this because I love her to death. I will play her something that I think is shit. Okay. Like I'll be editing and I'm like, I don't know. Like, did that clip? Did it sound this way? Did it sound that? She will not even pick up on it. And I'm like, did you hear that? Did you hear the difference? No, she didn't. And that's her set of ears. That's her perception of what it is I'm showing her. And she doesn't, honestly, it's not her interest, right? If it's her interest and it's produced on a low quality, she's going to be more entertained by it, right? And if it's her interest and it's a higher quality, she still may not tell the difference. And I think that's a better conversation to have as we're continuing our dBu Ranch Daze and conversations moving forward. And I'm really excited because we've tapped into a lot of different historical contextual things with vintage equipment, your personal experiences, what it was like being a young boy coming into the education system, learning from the education, then turning around and giving back and educating within the education system. And now having your own ranch, literal, right?
Yeah.
Literal studio, ranch side, you know, all this beautiful stuff. I'm so excited to see where it goes, not only for the ranch, but for yourself. And to be a part of that anyway, I can't be more humbled and thankful. So to close it out, I'd like for you to just give us any way that we can connect, your social media sites, of course, you know, all the different plugs that you have, and any shout outs that you'd like to give.
Absolutely. Well, I do want to respond to one thing you just said, because it's going to interrupt our closing long enough for me to make a very good point. And I think this will probably be the most valuable thing I have to say, that I think your listeners can consider my wisdom that I have to offer and my insight, coming from a 30-year-plus veteran who's worked in the audio industry. And it goes back to what you said about, you play something for your wife, sounds great. You play something for your wife, sounds great. She can't tell the difference. And my response to that is, this sort of highlights the problem we have on a commercial, or I would almost go so far as to say on a corporate level. Just the same way that a patient who's enduring a drug trial shouldn't have to decide what the dosage is for themselves. That's why we have doctors. We have scientists, people who are paid professionals who have studied the chemistry of the human body, and they've studied the chemistry of what different chemicals do, and they can look at some predictive outcomes and say, well, based on our predictive experiences, this is what we think will happen with this dosage. And then with this dosage, here are what we can expect. Here's the good, here's the bad. By the same way, I believe it's irresponsible for manufacturers, particularly in the audio world, to create technology, put it in the hands of non-experienced people, and tell them you can create a product that's going to be professional with the person not having any concept of how to properly use the hardware. So, you know, I think of it in light of what I was saying with this idea of, well, your wife can't tell the difference between one or the other. Well, it's unrealistic to expect the layperson to know that. They haven't spent their lifetime studying it. The people who should be making the standards and making these calls, the people who should dictate the regulation, if you will, of the airwaves, are not the people sitting in Washington, D.C., any more than your wife sitting in her living room. The people who should be dictating the standards are the agencies who have appointed themselves to do that. And that's what, back in the 60s and prior to that even, we had the Audio Engineering Society. It was created by professional broadcasters who knew we need standards. They need to be implemented across the board, not only in our own nation, but across the globe. There has to be a global standard that we can all agree to adhere to. What is good sound? That was determined by people back in the 40s and 50s. Germany themselves had a program called the Tonmeister program. And what they started doing was turning out people who were Tonmeisters, meaning masters of sound. They were being trained from the beginning to become masters of sound, and they would pass this on to the people after them. And they weren't allowed to become equipment operators until they had demonstrated some form of fidelity to their belief system.
Wow.
And that's honestly what we're missing. So the problem that we have with audio today, whether it goes to vinyl, it goes to tape, it goes to cassette. And when I'm trying to say tape, I want to draw a distinction between tape as in a master recording format versus cassette, which we used to listen to in the 80s. And then for that matter, any digital distribution format that comes out now. At the end of the day, the professional should be the one dictating what is proper. And the problem we have is once we put this technology in the hand of the layperson, they're the ones using the technology, creating the bulk of the product, which is why everything that we hear now sounds like butt. Because it's being made by people who have no clue how to make it sound good. And they hear their product because they created it. They're like, well, this sounds good to me. And as soon as somebody like myself gets involved and we're looking at it objectively saying, no, actually it sounds really bad. Like that mix I was describing that I had to deal with earlier where I got friends listening to my work saying, Dusk, it sounds terrible, but it's not the mix that sounds bad. It's the music in it that sounds bad. How did you let that pass muster? And my answer is, I didn't record it. The musician recorded it. And all I can do is tell them you're hurting yourself by allowing yourself to continue to make your own records. You should be employing somebody who can help you get better, to work out your problems that you don't even perceive you have. So
that is awesome.
To sort of close it up, truthfully, your wife's experience and your experience with her is exactly why I believe it's foolhardy to put recording tools in the hands of non-musicians, non-engineers and non-professionals, particularly something they expect to turn out, particularly if what they're expecting to turn out is going to be finished product.
Right.
And I do draw the distinction between, hi, I'm going to use my Pro Tools rig or my Logic rig or my iTunes or whatever, GarageBand, to make a recording of myself at home for the purposes of creating musical ideas and demos. That's great. That's the same thing we did back in the 80s. We bought the cassette 4-track with the understanding we would create music so that when we walked into a big recording studio, the idea was there.
And you're dialed in.
Yes,
polished.
We could play it for an engineer or producer, and they knew, okay, this is a direction you want to go. Now we're going to play it for the engineer. He knows what mics he needs to use to help you get the sound you want. He knows the type of studio that we should be working in. He knows how many tracks, whether you should be doing digital, whether you should be going analog. The engineer was entrusted with that responsibility based on that cassette. There were very few bands in the 80s that actually took the idea seriously of recording a record to a 4-track cassette, mixing that down to a stereo cassette, and then releasing that as an album. Nobody would have done that. You would have been laughed out of the park. It's like, are you kidding me? No one was going to take that seriously. That's a joke.
Yeah.
You go to a studio to make the music.
That's awesome.
And that's what's changed.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, we can go back to the analogy of, your craftsmanship within even fixing up classic cars. You don't want to get a car that has rusted out spots, cancers, or everything is bondo work, And that's something that I'm not saying it isn't good enough for a hobbyist. This of course, enjoy yourself. Enjoy working on your car, but when you come to a classic car show, like I think it's in Pebble Beach, can't go near it.
Yeah, I know the one you're talking about.
Yeah, can't go near it with that type of stuff. You can't even drive into it.
Don't laugh at you.
Oh my God. You'll be embarrassing yourself in the whole idea of having a classic car. Not saying that if you drove up with a very nice, 1965 Mustang that was finished appropriately, may still be a resto mod. Resto mods don't count. I mean, it still might have cost you $300,000, but this is true classic cars. Of course, they still have those too. But when you're looking at something of quality, it's like you can take a picture of Mona Lisa, doesn't mean that your picture of Mona Lisa is worth a crap, okay? But you still have the memory that you got to see Mona Lisa, right? And so with artists, I think this is a great place for them to not only become educated in industry standards, but how to work within the community of professionals of industry standards, which is just amazing.
Well, thank you. And to sort of touch on what you had asked before I interjected my last thought. Look, dBu Ranch was conceived as an idea many, many years ago. I just finally got to the point in my life where I was able to kind of focus it on becoming a reality. And to tie back to that first question you asked an hour ago, well, how did you end up here? I ended up here after 20 some odd years of meandering in my career, moving from different jobs, if you will. But the main thread the whole time was I am a recording engineer by trade, and I'm a recording engineer by heart. This is what I want to do, and this is all I'm going to do. There have been many times where I was on the verge of losing everything because I didn't have an income and things were rough, but I stuck with it. I'm like, I'm not going to give up what I do because this is what I know. dBu Ranch was built in many respects to be an affordable sanctuary for musicians who want to make records in the old style and do it in a scenario where Yeah, you may not have a $15,000, $25,000, $30,000 budget to make a record. As I've told artists before, you don't need that. I've had guys walk in here before, record a song in a day and walk out with something that is very presentable and has a very high quality polished sound, way better than anything they could have done on their own with 6 months of endless time at any studio in the world. The difference is that they walk in here, they're ready. And if they're not ready, I tell them before they walk in here, you're not ready yet. Why don't you guys give it another month? Rehearse the song. Your average recording studio doesn't make money doing that. They don't make money telling their artist who wants to play today, why don't you come back in 2 months? It's just not something that commercial studios do. So the focus that I have, because I've spent the last 30 plus years of my life making music that has to have some sort of ability to stand the test of time, I let artists know when they're ready. And when I tell them they're ready, they're ready. I set up the mics, I funnel it to the tape machine, I hit record, and when they come in and hear the playback, I'm picking jaws up off the ground. Nice. Is that because of anything that I did? I didn't play a dang note. I did nothing. What I did is I managed to capture their energy and to get them in the environment where that energy actually reinforces itself and it grows, it blooms, it turns into something that's exciting. As I said earlier, I capture lightning in a bottle. I don't set up microphones to record music. I capture performances. And that's what we do not hear in music today. So what I'm trying to do with dBu Ranch is to encourage people, yeah, it's a higher-end studio, and we're certainly priced in the upper echelons of the San Diego studio scene. Some might say, well, you're charging a lot. And I have to point out to them, a room like this in LA, just the room alone goes for almost $2,000 a day. Yeah. And that doesn't include my rate as an engineer. So we're going for well less than half that. When you sit down and you do the math, it's like, okay, this is actually an affordable space to make great music.
And the return of interest is profound. If it, like just having the conversation to wrap it up with dBu Ranch and of course back to 2 tracks, to have something that is not only viable but well polished and competitively priced is something that the communities of musicians, artists, other engineers need to be aware of to be able to expound their own opportunities of either self-awareness, identity, right, creationism, all the great artistic words that literally are able to provide growth, like you were saying about your artists. And that's something that, of course, you know, with anything, I think is very important. But let's go ahead and wrap up today, and let's rehash these conversations that we've had today with the amazing artists that we're going to be talking to one-on-one throughout the series that we have going with dBu Ranch Daze. But I'd like for you to plug your socials and websites or anything like that.
Thank you. So you can find me on social media. I'm on Instagram. It's dBu_ranch_recorders. And that's also our handle on YouTube as well. Yes, we do have a YouTube channel. We've probably got upwards of 60 or 70 videos on there, 10 of which are back to 2-track videos that actually demonstrate live bands from San Diego playing music live on the floor, being mixed live and recorded to stereo.
Amazing.
I would encourage you guys to watch them. A shout out to Brock Sanders, who does all of the photography for it. He's an excellent photographer. The videos look stunning. I mean, that's the one consistent commentary I'm getting, is that between the high quality of the audio and the high quality of the video, we're shooting stuff that looks better than our competition. The other guy I have to shout out to, Warren Sokol at WRS Mastering in Arizona. He's doing all the mastering for me because, again, I don't master my own work. His footprint, or I should say his fingerprint, is all over this music, and he's done a really good job of just reining in the levels and making sure that the stuff is competitive for playback on the internet, where level wars are kind of an issue.
Yeah.
And that's obviously finding me on Facebook. I know we're on Facebook. I believe it is also dBu_ranch_recorders. My website is www.duskbennet.com. It not only talks about my history, my discography, it's got a lot of photos that I've accumulated over the years. It talks obviously about our social media connections and how you can find us outside of our website. And last but not least, it's got a very detailed equipment list that kind of demonstrates down to almost everything we've got here, all the different bits and pieces of hardware. I mean, when you look at it just on paper, the studio is one of the best equipped studios south of Los Angeles. And it's because I've spent the last 30 years of my life collecting everything that I have. And it is now made available to San Diego musicians in San Diego's backyard for a fraction of the price of what it would cost to go to LA and work with a guy who doesn't know the band, doesn't know the sound, and has no interest or vested interest in the record succeeding. And because my main job is a producer engineer, I need my clients' records to succeed in order for me to succeed. So that's that simple. You guys want to work at a studio where you have a shot at the big time, you got a much better shot of it happening here than anywhere else, because I need my clients to succeed in order for my career to continue to succeed as well.
Well, that's amazing, Dusk. And honestly, I am just supremely humbled by both of our conversations, both days that we were able to get together and talk. And I look very much forward to continuing with the dBu Ranch Daze and with the artists that you have coming in here. And so our listeners, this was Dusk Bennet at dBu Ranch, and this is the Devil Dog Talk Show, as you know. Thank you for listening, and look forward to the next episode.
Internet, hello. This is the Irish number 4, and then he's a fin number representing Irish number 6, because he has me for shit.